Hello chess fans, in this video we're going to have a look at an absolute fantastic and crucial game for Arjun Erigaisi. He is playing with the black pieces against a super talent from Turkey. His name is Gurel. He is one of the biggest sensations of the recently concluded Olympiad in Budapest, on board 2, representing his country. He scored a marvelous 9 out of 11, winning a lot of rating points. He's only 15 years old, rated over 2600 and potentially one of the big guys in chess. Well, now Arjun Erigaisi is already a superstar. He is rated almost 2800, and if he wins this game, he actually crosses that magical barrier. Well, now it's not easy to win games at the highest level, but Arjun Erigaisi is a specialist when it comes down to playing against lower rated players. He was one of the superstars from the Indian team, which won the gold medal in Budapest last week. Now, different game. It's played in the German Bundesliga. It's a team event. And let's see what happens. It's an absolute thriller of a game, and I'm pretty sure you will enjoy it. And I do enjoy when you also help the channel to grow even further. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here we go. Gurel opens the game with the move 1 e4. Erigaisi goes for e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And here, small surprise. You know there are many different ways of playing, but in modern chess it's also very important to surprise your opponent. So Erigaisi goes for the almost forgotten move, bishop c5. It's a normal developing move, but it has run out of fashion. The so-called classical variation, bringing the bishop out to c5. It's an active square for that piece. The drawbacks though is that now with the move c3, and after knight f6, white can hit the bishop immediately. So black captures the pawn on d4. Obviously you can recapture, but a more ambitious move is to advance the e-pawn to e5, to hit the knight on f6. The knight comes in to d5, and this is actually kind of an interesting line, has been played a bit recently in a number of top games. One of the points is that if you do take, you can move the bishop away with check, and then very soon you can castle, you can play d6. Looks like black is doing okay. What white does is also more challenging. He castles. He doesn't recapture the pawn on d4. The point is that if you do take, the knight on d5 is hanging, so that is not a good recommendation for black. Bishop instead goes back to e7. Very important move. So the bishop is safe now. After now this move, pawn takes d4, the bishop is not hanging on c5, and black goes for the move d6, undermining that pawn on e5. White continues with knight c3, hitting the knight on d5, and black says, okay, I'm not interested to take, I want to develop my bishop to e6, so that if you do take, I take back with the bishop, and the bishop sits nice on that central square. White decides here to keep knights on the board. Knight comes into e4, with ideas to take on d6, for instance. Anyway, a6 is played to challenge the bishop. And of course, as so often in the Ruy Lopez Spanish opening, there is this choice between taking the knight or maintaining the tension with bishop a4. Gurel goes for bishop takes c6, doubling the pawns on the c-file, but in a way it's also helping black to stabilize the knight on d5. Here the bishop comes in to g5. So with the point that if bishops are coming off the board, black black ends up under pressure, I think, with the knight recapturing. Maybe the queen can come out. So black is not going to take here. Castling kingside played, rook c1, attacking the pawn on c6. And instead of defending that pawn, black played h6, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes, knight takes, so that the pawn is defended now. Rook e1, and black advances his a-pawn. So later on there are ideas perhaps to put a pawn on a4 and also to take the pawn on a2. Right now it's not very attractive to take that pawn on a2 because there's always b3. But with your pawn on a5 you can always rescue the bishop with a move like a4. Anyway, white played here b3, queen d7. Black has completed his development. The rooks are connected. And I think black can be quite satisfied with the outcome of the opening. But you know, Arjun Erigaisi wants to play for a win, and from this position it's not easy. You're solid, but let's see what he can do. h3, knight e5, the knight comes back to a more active post, knight fd2. And here you see that Erigaisi is trying to create some play. He goes for the move f5, and now after pawn takes f6, I'm pretty sure that the majority of normal people would just take back with a knight. And then maybe knights will come off. You can take back with the rook. Looks rock solid for black. But look at this. G takes f6. It's probably a move which would not have even crossed my mind. But why is Erigaisi going for this move, which weakens so much his king's position? Well, after the move queen f3, he wants to bring up the pawn to f5 to kick that knight away. The knight goes back to g3, and well, this pawn on f5, but also the pawn on h6, they're isolated, they're potentially weak, but at this point, the pawns are pretty well defended or not attacked enough by white's pieces. And well, here, now, after the move rook f6, maybe it was actually better to play the move f4 to attack the knight, and then later on you can bring up the rook, double the rooks, and try to play for an initiative on the king side. You do have some open files. Your pieces are directed at the white king. I'm not saying it's really good, but it's a very interesting approach. But rook f6 was played, but I doubt this is the right way of playing. Now knight h5 is an excellent move, hitting the rook. Rook goes to g6, and white offers the exchange of knights. And the more pieces are coming off the board, the more vulnerable these pawns will become. Bishop comes in to d5. So here you see that the rook and bishop are lining up against that pawn on g2. And what I would like to do here as white, but that's a difficult decision to make, is to play the move g3. To take away that pressure against the pawn. But you know, every pawn move in front of your king, it's sort of weakening. But the reason I think it's justified, black cannot really get access with the queen to the white king. And with a plan like, for instance, knight f1, knight e3, or maybe knight b1, knight c3, you can try to trade off that powerful bishop on d5. Instead, Gurel played knight f3, but the drawback is, on one hand, you defend against the pawn on g2. There's no immediate threat, but you're not contesting that monstrous bishop on d5. Here, rook f8 was played, the knight comes into h4, rook e6 played, and now the rooks are getting swapped. Rook takes e6, queen takes e6. One of the problems here is that you really would like to go rook c3, preparing a rook lift to hit the king. If you do that, there is queen e1 with check, and that is sort of problematic. So white got to prepare it, drop back with a knight to f3, so that after queen f6, the rook takes over control of the open file. Rook f7, rook e3. Now the rook is back again. King f8, king h2. And here it is, rook e7. And here you see that black really is going for the exchange of rooks, because it will make the king more safe. If the rooks stay on the board, and let's say the rook would end up on g3, there's always this lot of pressure with white's major pieces. So now rook takes rook, king takes back. And it seems to me that black is still okay in this endgame. Despite that weak pawn, it should be noted that the pawn on d4 is also quite vulnerable and requires protection. Knight h4, white hits the pawn. The bishop comes to e4, defends it. And who knows, on a good day, the bishop can come to b1. Knight f3 back. And here you see already that Gurel knows that he is holding the position and he's already repeating the moves. But black is not interested. King goes to d7. King goes to a safer spot. Queen e3. Bishop to d5. And the knight goes back to e1. Where's this knight going? Well, black played f4. Attacking the queen. The queen got to keep that pawn defended. Queen d2. And now the pawn comes to h5. Black is pushing on the king side. Note that the pawn on a5 is not hanging as it drops the pawn on d4, and that is definitely a favorable trade for black. So white played here the move f3, so that the pressure against the pawn on g2 is gone. But here black fixes the king side with h4 and f4. These two pawns are having a huge grip, preventing white from ever mobilizing that extra pawn on the king side. Now the king side is under control. After king g1, the bishop goes to f7, king h2, bishop d5. It's a repetition of moves. But now finally, black comes up with another plan. King c8. The king is coming over to the queen side. Knight c2, defending the pawn on d4. And here it is, king to b7. Now you're thinking, okay, that pawn on a5 can be taken, as the pawn on d4 is defended, but it was not done by Gurel. And I think it's a good decision, as it runs here into bishop takes f3. If you take the bishop, there is queen g6, with a double attack, and black does regain the piece. White instead played king h1, understandable move. Now queen takes a5 is a threat because there's no queen g6 with check any longer. The king goes to a6 to defend the pawn. What a fantastic maneuver, fantastic king walk to the other side of the board. Knight a3, queen f5, king h2, bishop to e6, so the 5th rank has been cleared. The queen is defending there. Queen f2, queen f6, defending the pawn on h4, queen d2, bishop f7, knight goes back to b1. Where's the knight going once again? Anyway, black is really gonna push now. c5, opening up the position. If you do take, you're taking back with the pawn, and in general the opening of the position will also give, for instance, the queen more possibilities of penetrating into white's camp. Queen e2 check played, and look at this. c4, fantastic idea. Nice way to solve the check. If you take the pawn on c4, it's queen takes d4, and here you do have a huge weakness on c4. The bishop will come in. Looks like black is taking over the initiative. Therefore, white didn't take on c4, but played the move knight a3. Now it is queen e6, offering the exchange of queens. Note that if queens are coming off the board, you can actually win a pawn here as white. If you do take with a knight, however, there is king b5, and this king is so incredibly strong. It's ready to walk in. Maybe you can go a4 with tremendous pressure against these pawns. This endgame is actually winning for black. Now, that is not played in the game. White had to keep queens on the board. Played here the move queen c2 with pressure on the c file. Black goes for the move d5, pawn takes c4, d takes c4. Black does have a passed pawn. Pawn is well supported by queen and bishop. Queen comes into a4, preparing a check. And, well, you can, of course, prevent it with queen e8, offering the exchange of queens again. But black went for c6. Looks understandable as well, covering the b5 square. Knight goes back to b1, queen g6, attacking the knight. Knight comes to c3, and here again, Erigaisi can simply play here this move. Queen g3, king h1, queen e1 check, king h2, and it's a repetition of moves. There's no better way of playing here. If you continue the game with queen takes c3, white at least has queen takes c6 with a number of checks. It's at least a perpetual. So, once again, Erigaisi doesn't want to draw. He's not giving the check on g3 and puts his bishop on d5. Knight takes d5, pawn takes d5. We have a super sharp queen endgame in which black is still trying to push his c-pawn. Queen d7, the queen comes in. Remember that queen g3 is still a draw. King b6, queen takes d5. White is winning the pawn, but now the queen comes to c6. And here again, the endgame, despite the minus pawn, the king and pawn endgame should be winning because the pawn is going to queen very fast. Therefore, white is forced to keep queens on the board, gives a check. Queen c7, black blocks it. Queen f6, another check. The king comes to b5. Queen f5 check, and the king comes to b4. Excellent move. Queen f8 check, very good idea. And now after the king goes back to b5, white pushes the pawn to d5. Fantastic idea. So that here, white is about to go d6 and attack the queen. And well, also white's d-pawn is very, very fast. So, for instance, if you play here the move c3, it was not played in the game. Fantastic line is d6, queen c6, for instance, and now queen e7. And let me show you, if both pawns are going to run, black queens first, but white also gets a second queen. It's a position with 4 queens on the board, but it's all about king safety, and white's king is just much safer than black. So probably this endgame should just be winning as the pawns are rather weak. In the game, they followed the move queen d7 though, instead of pushing the pawn. Now white played this fantastic idea a4. Note that if you play d6, the king will come back and the pawn on the d file will be eliminated soon. So here the point of a4 is to deflect that king. King takes pawn, and now the queen comes to c5 to control black's pawn on c4. And now, okay, objectively this should still be okay. If you play the move queen b5, very difficult line to calculate. It looks rather risky for black, but apparently after moving the king away and white pushes, black does the same. Now both sides are queening their c-pawn, but this is a favorable version compared to the other line we saw, as white's a-pawn is gone, and well, the black queens, they're controlling quite a number of squares, so likely this will end up in a repetition of moves at some point. Anyway, Erigaisi still playing for the win with the move king to b3, but there's this move d6. And now all of a sudden, this pawn is going to be decisive here. If black would play the move c3, there is queen c7. If the queen goes away, the d pawn is going to run. If you take on c7, here both pawns are not queening at the same time, as after c8 queen, white is first and controls the promotion square of black's passed pawn. White wins the game. That means c3 is not a good move. Queen g7 was played. Here you see that queen g3, queen e1 is still a defensive idea once again, but now this defensive resource comes too late. Queen b5 check, and here you got to make a very awkward move with your king, because anyway, one of the pawns will be captured with check. King c3, queen takes a5 with check, king b3, queen b5, king c3. You don't want to lose your pawn on c4. And now one very interesting move, which was not played. I mean, the move played by Gurel is also good, but queen e8, that's the move I really want to show you. I think this is beautiful, because now the idea with queen g3 check, king h1, queen e1 doesn't work. The queen covers that square, while the queen also does support the march of the d-pawn. This is a technical win, multifunctional move combining attack and defense. Instead, white played the move king h1, also good, avoiding queen g3 coming with check, queen d4, now the pawn comes to d7, and look, white's pawn is much further advanced than the pawn on c4. If you play king d2, for instance, there is queen a5 check, and next move, the d-pawn will be promoted. So king d2 is not good, king d3 was played, now it is queen to c6, that is of course a good move. King d2 was played, because there are also ideas here just to play something like queen e4 with check. So therefore king d2, queen c7, and now d8 queen is coming next, king e1, d8 queen. And here Erigaisi of course understands that things have gone wrong. He sets up the last trap with queen a1. If you now, for instance, give a random check, that would be the losing move even, because there's king f2 with discovered check, king h2, it's even black who's giving checkmate. Now, that is something only a beginner will fall into this trap. Erigaisi Gurel, 15-year-old super talent, is not going to make that mistake. He just avoided all this nonsense by playing the move queen a5, and here it's check. You do force the exchange of queens. Queen takes a5, and the game is over. Fantastic game, and that means that Arjun Erigaisi needs to wait a bit longer to cross the 2800 barrier. That's a pity for him, but undoubtedly he will get there one day. If not, it would be a really missed opportunity for him. But anyway, Erigaisi Gurel, super talent. I'm pretty sure I will cover him many more times in the future on the channel. So keep an eye on it, and I will see you soon again.